Another day, another scandal rocks the Obama White House. It is the latest power grab by the administration, and it has to do with your personal phone records. Now, according to the Guardian newspaper, the federal government, under a secret court order, has been gathering the phone records of millions of Verizon customers, requiring the company to hand over to the National Security Agency information on telephone calls in its system. But in typical fashion, the president's allies ran out immediately to come to his defense, and that included the chairwoman of the Senate Finance and Senate Intelligence Committee, Democrat Dianne Feinstein. Now, she said, quote, "This renewal is carried out by the FISA court under the business records section of the Patriot Act. Therefore, it is lawful. It has been briefed to Congress." But unfortunately for Senator Feinstein, many lawmakers on both sides of the aisle refute her claim, and even the left-leaning New York Times, they are starting to distance themselves from the administration. Now, the editorial board of the Times posted an article about the latest scandal. They wrote, quote, "The administration has now lost all credibility." And then in a shocking twist and a bit of a reversal, hours later, the paper of record, they seemed to backtrack a bit of their critique of the administration. They updated the editorial to read, quote, "The administration has now lost all credibility." And then they added, "on this issue." Pretty unbelievable. That's not all. Also breaking tonight, Fox News has confirmed that the NSA and the FBI since 2007 have been tapping into various internet companies. Now, the Washington Post first broke this story just hours ago, and according to the report, this includes pictures, videos, and even emails. And we continue with former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. Before I ask you your thoughts on this, I want you to answer what you think about it through the prism of then-candidate Obama in 2007.
When I'm president, one of the first things I'm going to do is call in my attorney general and say to him or her, "I want you to review every executive order that's been issued by George Bush, whether it relates to warrantless wiretaps or detaining people or reading emails or whatever it is. I want you to go through every single one of them, and if they are unconstitutional, if they're encroaching on civil liberties unnecessarily, we are going to overturn them."
Your reaction?
Well, I mean, look, I think the gap between President Obama's rhetoric and reality is so massive that I'm never surprised that what he says has no relationship to reality. This is a man, after all, who just 2 weeks ago told us the war on terror was over, and we're now learning that the war on terror is so real that we are basically looking at virtually every American. Now, one or the other has to be true. And I think it's just one more example that the president, I think, has an enormous gap between what he says and the real world. And so I don't pay a lot of attention to the fact that there's this enormous gap. I take it as a fact of everyday life. You know, he promised an open, transparent administration. Virtually every member of his cabinet has a secret email account, which is illegal. You just go down the list of things he's promised that he failed on, and it's nice to notice that the New York Times actually found something on which they have lost faith in him.
What do you think about the sheer numbers in the Verizon case? And then, of course, we have the PRISM issue, which literally they're monitoring the servers of Microsoft, Yahoo, Google, Facebook, AOL, Skype, YouTube, Apple. The scope seems massive.
Well, there are two things that people ought to ask themselves about this. The first is, and this is where the Internal Revenue Service scandal is so devastating, why would you trust this government with any private information? This is a government which we clearly know now with the IRS was asking Christian conservative groups, what were you saying in your prayers? They were asking an 83-year-old woman what she was saying at her coffee club on Friday mornings. Why would you try? I mean, I think this is a huge problem that people have to really ask themselves, do you really trust this government with that kind of information? Yeah. But there's a second problem, Sean. When you gather all this data, you don't know what you're looking for. With all this information, why couldn't they figure out that there were two Chechens who had bombs in Boston? Why couldn't they figure out that there was a Pakistani who was creating a car bomb in Times Square? The fact that they relentlessly refuse to profile and be accurate and focus on people likely to kill us, and so instead they gather mounds of data about everybody, actually I think weakens our ability to find out the people who are the most dangerous.
It seems like if you hired millions of people, you wouldn't be able to sift through all that, would you?
Well, they do it all by computer and by code word and looking for specific things. But it's obvious. You can ask yourself the question, if they had all this data, how come they didn't find either the Pakistani car bomber in New York or the 2 Chechen bombers in Boston? What does that tell you? How come they couldn't find Major Hassan, who, by the way, is still getting paid his salary 43 months after he was imprisoned for killing 13 Americans at Fort Hood? I mean, you have to ask yourself, what is it they're missing when they have all this information on innocent people and they can't figure out who the guilty are?
You know, it's also a little bit odd to me that the president was against this. Now, I guess he's for it. He was against enhanced interrogation, but he's all for drone strikes, and Gitmo is still wide open. You know what's the scariest thing in all of this? You know, after he lost his presidential election, Al Gore went off the rails, and he actually sent out a tweet today. You know things are really bad when I start agreeing with Al Gore, which nobody ever thought would happen. But he wrote, in the digital era, privacy's got to be a priority. Is it just me, or is a secret blanket surveillance obscenely outrageous? He's come back to his senses.
Well, no, I'm very surprised Al Gore didn't suggest this was just one more example of global warming. So you may be right.
I may be right. I'm looking and think, do I have to rethink where I am in this? All right, Mr. Speaker, good to see you. Thanks for being with us.
Good to be with you.
And welcome back to Hannity. The Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder, faced a grilling on Capitol Hill today during a Senate Appropriations Committee hearing. And while this was scheduled to discuss the Justice Department's budget, well, let's just say lawmakers did not stick to that topic. Instead, they took every opportunity to ask about the growing scandals surrounding the nation's top cop, the administration's use of drones, and, of course, Gitmo. Now, let's take a look at these highlights.
The controversy that has embroiled the department has called into question its ability, I believe, to fairly administer law and justice. Further, the questionable actions of the Attorney General, I believe, have tarnished the integrity, impartiality, and efficacy of the position of Attorney General.
The department has not prosecuted, and as long as I have the privilege of serving as Attorney General of the United States, will not prosecute any reporter for doing his or her job.
It troubles me that the president has virtually unreviewable, unfettered authority to order the killing of any American citizen overseas who is suspected of terrorist activity without any kind of charge or trial or judicial review.
With all due respect, I would say that it's incorrect to say that it is only in the that the president has unlimited authority in this regard. I also want to assure the American people and you as well that I am fully engaged in that regard. And sure, I go through a self-evaluation process almost on a daily basis. I have not done a perfect job. I think I've done a good job.
The point is here, and this is the point that has to be made over and over again with the Rosen case and with the AP listening to their phone lines case or tapping to see where they were calling, and that is that the national security justification was nonsense. It was bunk. That is the issue here, and particularly in light of the revelations today about these Verizon phone calls, which, again, in the abstract, if they're just looking for patterns in phone numbers called, not looking at the content of the phone call, and submitting every phone call made in America into a computer to look for patterns, to look for terrorism, well then, under an honorable administration, and even an honorable Democratic administration, if you can think of one, you'd say, fine, that's fantastic, we want to be protected from a terrorist attack. The problem with this administration and with Eric Holder is we can't trust them, and in point of fact, what we have learned, particularly in the last few weeks, is they don't care about terrorism. They want to spy on their political enemies. That makes it a problem for the Verizon case, for the PRISM case, and for the James Rosen case.
Doesn't it also make it a problem because they kind of thought the war on terror was over, and they were and he spoke out against it, huh?
No, exactly. And you will recall during the Bush administration when they were getting FISA court warrants to follow and listen in on phone calls made terrorist phone numbers, to numbers found on terrorist computers. Every once in a while, they would cite an actual case where this was used, where it was helpful in stopping a terrorist attack. How about the administration give us that? But no, as Speaker Gingrich just said, they didn't have to listen to anybody's phone line to find Major Hassan down at Fort Hood. He had just shot up a room full of troops. And what happens to him? He's paid hundreds of thousands of dollars until, I suppose, he's convicted here. This is not an administration that takes terrorism seriously. What they take seriously is harassing Americans, harassing their political opponents, and whether they're journalists or not, and any kind of power, even a power. But I think we should not go too far to say that these powers should not ever be used by an administration. Like I say, I think they should go after someone like Julian Assange, and I don't care if he's a journalist, if it's actually national security.
You're raising a great legal point, and Andy McCarthy pointed this out in his column today, and there's a 1979 case, Smith versus Maryland, in a decision there. And the issue of telephone record information is very different from content. And they held in that case that, in fact, the content of conversations is very different. So then they weren't getting content.
That's protected by, right.
That's protected.
The content is protected by the Fourth Amendment. The fact that you made a phone call is not. Now, that doesn't mean Congress can't legislate and say, no, we're not going to give you this power. It just means the Constitution doesn't require it. And I must say, after all of these scandals from this unbelievably corrupt administration, unbelievable how they harass their political opponents, as we found out just in the last few weeks, particularly out of the IRS. I think Congress ought to pass a law suspending the power to even look at the phone numbers until late January 2017, because you cannot trust this administration.
All right, I have a legal question then as it relates to PRISM, where they were looking at Yahoo, Google, Facebook, AOL, Skype, where they said they were extracting audio, video, photographs. That sounds to me that this is content. Does that cross the line in your view?
Yes, I must say, I think we need to know more. I could be wrong, but at this moment I'm suspecting that the Washington Post is wrong, because that would be
probably a good
Fourth
assumption.
Amendment violation.
Well, you know, it's interesting. The New York Times for a few hours tonight actually had it right. They said the president has lost all credibility, and then they couldn't leave it. They just had to add on this issue hours later. No,
and the opposite is the truth.
That's true.
And that's a big problem for what ought to be actually important methods of gathering national security and protecting America from a terrorist attack. But this administration cannot be trusted. I mean, way beyond. I can't imagine, and as you know, I wrote a book saying he should be impeached. I can't imagine President Clinton surrounding himself with people who would engage in it to this degree. I mean, yeah, okay, Paula Jones was audited. Probably the IRS was used to harass political enemies for a few years under Clinton. But the journalists, and now, if the Washington Post is telling the truth,
but that's such a fishing expedition. It's like going after grandma and little babies at the TSA going through security.
Right.
Yeah, all right.
No, this administration has lost the ability to be trusted, and this is why the framers said, and they didn't say this about congressmen or senators, but you need a virtuous man in the presidency, so choose wisely next time, America.
Well said. Ann Coulter, good to see you.